Ahoy! And never has this introduction to a video been more fitting, because today we're talking about the one and only pirate, Poseidon. Well, not necessarily a pirate, but I like to play the pirate skin. The reason we're talking about Poseidon is because yesterday I put Poseidon relatively high in a tier list, and I was asked afterwards if I could make a guide to explain how Poseidon works at the moment, and that's what we're doing today. It's not going to be a super edited, basic level guide. Like, there's a bit of an expectation here that you kind of know how Poseidon works, but we're going to go over his ability still a little bit, and then just go a bit more in depth with the current playstyle. I spammed Poseidon today just to make sure that everything I say holds up, and I would say it holds up pretty well overall. So why is Poseidon even in the meta when he hasn't really been changed? Well, that's because there is a new item that we had for a while, and that's Ring of Hecate. Just in case you've been sleeping under a rock, Ring of Hecate comes with 80 magical power, 25% attack speed, 15% magical lifesteal, and if you attack an enemy, then your power gets increased by 5% per attack, and their power gets decreased by 5%. And this is obviously very important, and this plays a big role in why Poseidon works so well with it. Power gets increased up to 3 times and stacks last for 5 seconds. Now we have to take a look at Poseidon's kit, and the first thing that we have there is the passive, changing tides, something that is often overlooked. Now, why is tide so important here? When you increase your tide, you will get additional ability damage, up to 20% extra damage, and you will get extra movement speed, up to 15% at max tide. And the tide increases by 10% per basic attack. So if you have a lot of basic attacks that you can use on the enemies because you have a lot of attack speed, then you're gonna stack tide quicker. And normally in the old Poseidon builds, that was kind of a secondary thing, I would say. You would try and get your tide high, but that wasn't really how you necessarily were always able to play, because often you would just throw out your abilities in the best situation, and that was pretty much about it. Now, with these new builds, with these attack speed oriented builds, I would say, not purely focused, you're able to actually get a lot more tide, meaning that your abilities end up dealing similar damage even though you're building less into direct damage items in the same way you would normally. So the trade-off here is honestly relatively low. The only thing that you lose over more standard mage builds is cooldown reduction. Now, those builds are still possible on him, and you can also get an ability build where you only include Ring of Hecate, but there's a lot of flexibility in that regard, and I think it's best applied with a significant amount of attack speed. That's partially because Poseidon's base attack speed isn't the highest of the AA mages, because he's not really an AA mage, and if you invest into it a little bit more, then it becomes more effective. Likewise, I also think that Demonic Grip is still a very strong item to include in many mage builds, though I wouldn't always necessarily build it, and that way you can also apply a lot of shred to enemies before you get the rest of your abilities off, which again will also significantly impact your ability damage on them. Now let's briefly talk about ability leveling before we get into ability usage. On your first level, you want to get your one Tidal Surge, because Tidal Surge has the highest damage, quickest cooldown and everything on level 1. It is your best clearing tool for level 1 specifically, as long as you are against a mage that allows you to kind of go into the wave a little bit. If you get punished too hard with that, then it might be a problem, but even then I would probably prefer Tidal Surge just on the back arches over Whirlpool on the full wave. That's preference at that point, but yeah, I would level the 1. Then on the second level, you would level the 3. And from that on, I would prioritize the 3 because it really is the ability that gets more utility over time, as it gets reduced cooldown with every point you put into it. Once you reach level 5, the ability you want to max is Release the Kraken, because it gets a longer stun, gets higher damage and everything. It's just too good not to, in my opinion. But normally, you would go into Tidal Surge after you finish leveling Whirlpool, because, you know, it's your next ability that is ability damage, and then you can use the Trident upgrades later on. With these builds, with these more attack speed focused builds, I would prioritize the 2 over the 1, with the exception of level 1, of course. But I think in later stages, the Trident effect is too useful not to get it. You get more base damage per hit, and you already have a bit of attack speed at that point if you have Ring of Hecate. And you get increased movement speed from 10 to 30%, which is massive even as an escape. And you also get reduced cooldown by 2 seconds per rank, which is huge. So it really makes a difference between coming online around mid-game and coming online around late-game. I tried both in these games, and I definitely felt better when I maxed the Trident second than when I max the Tidal Surge tech, and it's really not necessary because that ability also scales pretty nicely with 70%. It's just a little bit of extra base damage. That's not so important, honestly. Now, what changes in your ability usage? Honestly, not that much, because obviously you're still going to use your Whirlpool in combination with your Kraken in order to ensure that the enemies can't get out of it in most situations. However, what you have to keep in mind is that Whirlpool becomes more than just a tool to set up your Kraken, it also becomes a tool to set up your basic attacks. And it's a pretty scary one, because if someone is getting sucked into the Whirlpool and you're beating down on them with your 2 activated, that is some heavy damage now, especially if you have at least Ring of Hecate and possibly Demonic Grip, or even if you go for Hastened Ring and you're just super fast attacking them. Tidal Surge is something you want to put a little bit more on hold because it won't do that much damage and it'll knock enemies away. This is more a self-peel in many situations, or just an attempt to finish someone off that you couldn't otherwise get. So generally speaking, it's minor differences, and ideally you want to try and get some basic attacks on the enemy before you use your 3 and old combo, because if that happens to be the case, then you will get the increased damage from Ring of Hecate, from Demonic Grip, and from the increased tide of your passive. So it's a massive amount of things at once. And the Trident effect lasts long enough for that not to be a problem either. And it also is a much bigger shock effect when they just get hit by some, alright basic attack damage, and then all of a sudden the Whirlpool Kraken comes into that. It's very, very hard to deal with for many enemies. Now let's talk a little bit about the builds. The starter item depends a little bit on which lane you're playing as well, but generally speaking, I would probably still play him in mid and not that much ADC, and it depends on your preference. I personally prefer Mage's Blessing because the early ability damage is nice, it bridges the gap a little bit and you get the cooldown reduction, which I think is very beneficial, but I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with starting Hunter's Blessing either. I think the MP5 is quite nice on that. And it increases your basic attack damage a little bit, but you have to keep in mind it does not increase the additional attacks from your Trident. Those are just ability damage and not actual basic attacks. So my preference is Mage's Blessing, whatever is yours, is yours. Then you also want to get a tier 1 Emerald Ring along with that, so you can get into Ring of Hecate as quickly as possible. Then, depending on the situation, you can go right into Ring of Hecate, or you build your boots first. That's a little bit of preference. I do think normally boots first is just safer, especially in middle lane. And then in terms of boots, I would go for Shoes of the Magi. The extra lifesteal is great and the extra power helps you, again, bridge that early game. It does a little bit more for you in terms of boxing. I think CDR is just not as important for this particular build. After that, your choice is more flexible already. I would generally build Typhon's Fang, but now after the nerf, it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming anymore, and that combination, Ring of Hecate on its own does a lot as well. So you can also consider going straight into more attack speed and going into a Demonic Grip. At this point, you should already have no issue clearing anymore, and on that note, I should maybe mention, when clearing with Poseidon, make sure not to spam both abilities unless you know it's safe. Typically, you want to use the 1 primarily to clear, or the 3, depending on what lane opponent you're against and how risky it is to use either. I like to use the 1 so I can keep the 3 to box into them afterwards, which can be very dangerous once you have a little bit of attack speed. In terms of additional attack speed items, you can basically look at the entire ring tree. I wouldn't build all of it every game, but adapt it depending on the situation. Often you will find that Demonic Grip will fit into your build quite well in order to get that protection shred. And Hastened Ring can be very nice to really run enemies down and really make the maximum use of Poseidon's high mobility. So when you can fit it in, I would recommend doing so. Though it's not necessarily always the first one I would rush after Hecate, because it is one that doesn't come with quite as much damage. Telekine's Ring can also be considered, but I rarely see myself getting around to it because I think there are other items that are just often more important. But outside of that, there are even more items that you want to consider. One of them is Gem of Isolation. Gem of Isolation on Poseidon technically isn't anything new, but in combination with these attack speed focused builds, it's even more frustrating for the enemy. If you're stuck in the Whirlpool, slowed down, getting sucked in, and getting basic attacked to death, that is just super rough to deal with. Another item that I also think is great is Toxic Blade. It gives you a little bit more attack speed, it also gives you mobility, and it gives you a little bit more survivability while providing you with anti-heal. Anti-heal is incredibly important in the current meta, and in almost every game there is reason to build anti-heal. I can really not find many games where anti-heal is not useful at all. You can get Divine Ruin for this as well. That's really up to you. If you want to go a bit more ability-based, ability-focused, that is also completely fine. I really like Toxic Blade for that purpose, but either is good. If tanks are causing you issues in later stages, I think Soul Reaver is always good to have, even in a more ability-focused build, because it gives you some extra flat pen, especially if you have Typhon's Fang already. That's just nice 20% that you get there. And it also comes with that additional damage effect for higher burst, and then you really have the best of both worlds. It's not something you can always afford to put in your build. Sometimes you need more utility, more speed or something else, but when you can fit it in, it's very nice. If you want something that's more towards your basic attacks as well, then Rod of Tahuti is of course a fantastic choice because it amplifies everything. And then last but not least, having a late game defensive option is always a good choice as well. I think, for example, Mantle of Discord is great here. On the current patch, also Height of the Enemy in line, but especially Mantle of Discord because you are already so agile, so mobile, and you have such an easy time getting away from enemies. And this way, if they ever catch up to you, they get disrupted anyways, and you have another chance to get away, and you also have some extra cooldown reduction. So a lot of nice benefits there altogether. A well-played Poseidon on the current patch is one of the most frustrating characters to deal with, and until Ring of Hecate sees significant nerfs, I think these attack speed focused builds are, in my personal opinion, preferable to the more traditional ones, even though both work pretty well for him right now. As such, I can highly recommend giving those types of builds a spin. If you enjoyed this video and you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell, so you get notified of other upcoming SMITE content of all sorts. And other than that, I'll see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.